just a few moments' time. But first, to Ukraine. Joe Biden's top diplomat will try to defuse a crisis with Moscow over Ukraine. He's going to meet the Russian foreign minister later this week. It follows visits with Ukrainian leaders in Kiev and European leaders in Berlin. Let's get some more on this, if we can, from Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, thank you very much for your time this morning. The meeting then that will take place on Friday between diplomats from Washington and the Kremlin, is that likely to succeed, Alan?
Well, I think it's unclear whether the meeting will succeed, because two things will determine ultimately whether Russia will go to war. Firstly is the defense of Ukraine that the West decides to mount, in however that looks and however that is played out. So that's the sort of point number one, which is how seriously will we take the option of deterring Vladimir Putin before he takes action. The second part, of course, is Vladimir Putin's own calculations of whether he's likely to be successful. Now, the first bit obviously ties into the second bit, but even then there's an independent calculation which also involves things like the weather to determine whether he's actually going to be successful in any move. And that will determine really where we're going with this, whether he's going to pull back and go for some kind of diplomatic solution, or whether it is going to be war after all.
And in this country, the Foreign Office, we understand, has been told to prepare for crisis mode, with weapons going from Britain to the Ukraine to bolster its defences. What's our role here?
Well, our role is simple. Clearly, Ukraine is a democratic ally. They have requested defensive weapons. And note, these are defensive weapons. These are not weapons that would be used in any offensive against Russia. However, they would be used in any defence against Russia. So, from our perspective, this is very much a case of Britain standing firm with Ukraine, saying, we are with you in the sense that we will support your right to defend yourself in the event of an invasion.
Germany also suggesting yesterday, I think, that it could halt the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia if Moscow does invade Ukraine. And on that, let me just get the quote here, if I can, from Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He met with the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, saying it was clear there will be a high price to pay and that everything will have to be discussed should there be a military intervention in Ukraine. Is that likely to change minds in Moscow?
Well, part of Putin's reasoning in the last couple of years has been to try and get that pipeline approved. And he's gone to quite extraordinary lengths to do that, including, of course, most recently playing around with Europe's gas supplies to try and encourage the belief that you need this direct link to go in there. So, yes, it might do, but it's only one calculation of many for Putin. There are other factors in terms of what he wants to do. Let's be realistic. If he did want to swallow Ukraine up, he's got then control the transit rights of gas anyway, because he'd, of course, be controlling Ukraine territory. So this is a factor. He does want this, of course, but whether it is a decisive factor and whether he believes the Germans will actually do it, of course, is another key matter. Let's not forget the Germans yesterday refused to allow British, the defensive weapons to Ukraine to cross their airspace. That's hardly a message, is it, that you can take the Germans very seriously on this?
Jens Stoltenberg, we mentioned, the NATO Secretary General, also the former Prime Minister of Norway. And of course, Norway is, by some definitions, our closest neighbour, one of our closest neighbours here in the UK. We forget that it stretches all the way around and actually does border Russia. So Jens Stoltenberg will have some knowledge of dealing with Russia, I guess, in the past. Is he a useful person for that reason, do you think, to be NATO Secretary General at this point?
Well, yes. Look, I think obviously he's got personal experience in this area, and he will, have the geographical knowledge, if you like, of abutting Russia in that way. But the reality is that he represents a defensive alliance himself that spans numerous countries who will be all alarmed at the idea that that there can be force used to conquer another country within the European sphere in 2022. That is something that whoever is a NATO Secretary General would be principal among their thoughts.
Many people listening will be wondering how bad potentially this might get for us in this country. So let's just take that selfish perspective for a moment. If there is an invasion, if this does lead to war against Ukraine by Russia, how might it spread? How bad might it get?
Well, firstly, you've got to factor in that gas prices, no doubt, and oil prices will probably spike dramatically. We already have a disastrous moment with that. This will get much worse, of course, should there be an invasion. So you're going to see an immediate hit in that regard. Then, of course, you're going to, there are lots of imponderables as to how this conflict works out, how long it will take, etc. And of course, that while that conflict rages, there will, of course, be other matters to consider in terms of its spread potentially beyond the borders of Russia and Ukraine. There have been discussions, for example, the Russians perhaps making a move in Moldova with Transnistria, that zone there. There's talk that they might go transit Belarus. We've got a long-standing issue of Kaliningrad, of course, which is a Russian enclave between Lithuania and Poland, which could well come into play somehow as well. So the idea that once Putin's on the move, you can restrict the conflict simply to Ukraine is unlikely. There's likely to be blowback into Europe, which will affect our NATO allies, who we are then also compelled to be defending. So the idea suddenly is that you could have what at first appears to be just a Russia-Ukraine dispute, which could then turn into a cross-European conflagration one way or another. And I don't mean to say, of course, that we're going to be at war with Russia, but there's clearly going to be instability effects. There could be refugee flows, all sorts of things hitting this country as a result of this move, which is why it's so important that deterrence takes a primary aim here and that we try and stop this from happening.
Alan, thank you. Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society.